Good evening. Welcome to this launch event for 3 new books published by Bloodaxe this month. George Szirtes, Fresh Out of the Sky, Claire Askew, How to Burn a Woman, and Annemarie Austin, Shall We Go? These are 3 very different poets, but I'm hoping that when we have a discussion at the end, some of the themes that they have in common in their work may be discussed. Although their work in some way is concerned with history, personal history, oppression, memory in particular, stories. So there are a lot they do have a lot in common despite being very different poets. We're going to read in the order. We're starting with George Szirtes, then we're going to have Claire Askew, and then we're going to have Annemarie Austin, and then we'll have the same order again. Annemarie Austin isn't live. She's now in her late 70s and not technologically sort of involved as other poets are. She still sends me her manuscripts on typescripts done on a manual typewriter, so she doesn't have a computer, or let alone being on the internet and so on. So she sent an audio recording of poems from her new book, and we're going to hear her reading some of those poems with the poems on screen. So we're going to start with George Szirtes. He's one of Britain's leading poets, as everyone knows. He won the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2004. And Bloodaxe has published 8 books by him, including a new and collected poems in 2008. He fled to England with his family after the 1956 Hungarian uprising, and many of the poems in this book relate to his arrival in England as a young child. There are poems relating to country, identity, memory, belonging, war, and upheaval. And there's also a sequence of poems relating to living in a country under siege from coronavirus. So would you please welcome George Szirtes reading from Fresh Out of the Sky.
Thank you, Neil. I'll begin with 3 poems from the section of the book which is at the front, which is about coming to England first, being a child in England, and spending 5 or 6 years here and getting used to the place and what it means. This sequence sort of relates to the sequence in Real, which is about childhood in Hungary, and in English Apocalypse about growing up in the 1970s. This first one is Boarding House, which is where we stayed on a Kent coast, along with quite a lot of other refugees, in an out-of-season boarding house in the winter of 1956. Dark corridors, crammed bedrooms, stairs that smell of cigarette smoke and impermanence. Long days of waiting, ringing of the bell that calls us to our dinner, shillings and pence that fill the hand, the wallpaper, the pulse of other people's half-heard arguments, the landlord's dog, interminable phone calls in the lobby. Someone is falling apart, another's longing to be somewhere else. You hold on to the street map of your heart and make yourself at home. You're here at last, whatever here now means. Now you can start your childhood again. The world, a mythic past you'll wander into by mistake. The joys of lost performance with a vanished cast of now imagined names that other boys might whisper just to put you in a spin. It is another language that deploys a tottering edifice that you live in. Strangers will come and go, are gone for good. The bedroom's empty. Here is a new skin for you to wear in the enchanted wood. The second poem is called Waking to the Sea. Hungary, where I was born, is a landlocked country. There is no sea. So the first time we saw the sea was in England on the south coast. It was a huge tremendous, external, other kind of thing. Waking to the sea. It's too far out, too great an undertaking, even to imagine it, plumbed deep into your chest, its huge heart aching for what it can't yet have, not while you sleep. Tuck yourself in. The sea is black as night and as invisible, its pitch too steep to climb or contemplate. Your skin is tight as the sheets that tie you down, as stiff as death, but not your death, not yet. Then light arrives, a thin grey wall of mist, as if the air itself had risen out of damp and hung before you, solid as the cliff down in the bay. Put on the bedside lamp. Listen, there it is, that constant roar that is the bottom line, its thrust and slump echoing in you, moving under the floor you stand on. It is the island you can't see, but know is there. You've not been here before, but now it seems it's where you're meant to be. They'll find you now. There's no place to hide, but in your head, with its brief history. Stand up. It's morning. Time to go outside. In a third of these, there are 25 of them in the set. This is about, it's called English rain. It's about that sort of rain which I've always associated with England. It's kind of continuous and in a damp climate. This rain, this unremitting, stoical drench that defined everything by fully soaking it, was now home. It was like living in a trench in a war that never started. Men were smoking it in offices through rain-blurred windows. They stood in melancholy doorways, mentally stroking it, as you might a sodden dog. Rain was a hood you wore in the street and took off once at home. It was another name for England. It was a good you lived by for months on end that would come on time like buses that once arrived don't go. This was childhood in winter, the proper medium for study and squalor, into which you'd grow like a plant into soil, putting down your roots. Each shower was eternity, an endless flow of sustenance and drowning. Pull on your boots, wear your raincoat. It's winter now, forever. It is time, in one of its worn-out old suits, that glorified gentleman inclined to shiver and grumble. Meanwhile, you watch the children run through puddles, crossing streets and seeking cover, like something ending that has not begun. And I'll finish this set with a short poem from a section which is about dreams. And this is a dream of television. It's in a kind of song form. I woke up dead and turned on the TV, and there I was. The rumors were all true. That face was mine. How could it not be me? I gazed at it and said, yes, that is you. But I was like another, with a name I could not speak, another who was dead. I was the child I had been, still the same. My eyes, my mouth, my ears, my nose, my head. You see, Nuncle, it said, we are the same, but who that is, I really cannot say. I'm just a dead, and I don't have a name. Let's meet again, it said, and turned away.
Thank you, George. You've just heard George reading from his new collection, Fresh Out of the Sky. And next we will hear Claire Askew reading from hers. This is her second collection. Her debut collection was shortlisted for 4 major first collection awards: the Edwin Morgan Poetry Award, the Saltire Society First Book of the Year Award, the Seamus Heaney Centre Prize, and the Michael Murphy Memorial Prize. Sorry, that's 5. The Edwin Morgan Poetry Award was an earlier award. She's also a novelist, and she writes crime novels featuring D.I. Birch, which are published by Hodder and Stoughton. And the new poems in her book are about outsiders, witches, women who don't fit into society, with settings ranging from London buses and Edinburgh closes to the streets of Salem, Massachusetts. And the book is very much an investigation of power and oppressive systems and their hold. So I'll leave Claire to introduce the poems. Claire.
Thank you very much, Neil, and thank you, George, for starting the night off. It was really nice to hear some of your poems. A lot of the poems in this book are about real historical people who were accused of witchcraft and executed. And I'm going to read 3 of those poems just now. As the topic suggests, there is going to be some reference made to torture and execution. I'm not going to say anything graphic, but if that sounds like something you don't want to hear about, I will completely understand. And you can feel free to mute me. And when Annemarie's poems begin, that should be obvious because they'll come up on the screen and then you can unmute again. So just a little trigger warning. I'm going to start by reading a poem about Anne Askew, who was my 13 times great aunt. And she was a poet, one of the first female poets to compose in the English language. She was also a Protestant scholar and a political protester. And in 1546, she was tried, sentenced to being tortured in the Tower of London, one of only 2 women ever to be tortured in the Tower of London. And she was burned at the stake. She wasn't actually sentenced under witchcraft legislation. She was sentenced as a heretic, but the legislation under which she was sentenced was later kind of drawn on and amalgamated into a subsequent witchcraft act. So she was sort of a forerunner to a lot of the other people that I write about in this book. I'm very proud to be her descendant. So this is Anne Askew, died 1546. You lived for a month in the White Tower, saying nothing in the cross-examination, saying nothing as the men came in, went out, as they swung the various instruments of their work, whistled in the passageways. It was June, and in the garden by the tower where the ladies walked, the honeysuckle pushed its ragged blooms out of the wall like hands. They showed you the rack, told you how they'd pop your hips and shoulders from their sockets, dislocate your elbows and knees. You didn't speak, but climbed the device's side, lay your ankles in the straps. A man once told me every human being gets 2 deaths. The second one's the last time someone living says or writes your name. Anne, it's been 570 years since they lifted you down, your secrets still wound in the cord of your throat, the women whose locations you withheld awake and listening from their beds. I am weak, but Anne, I will keep committing your name as if it's a crime, so the distant children's children of those men whose second deaths came long ago will know you when you're spoken of. They'll know that you were 25, that you were told you would be burned. They'll know that as you waited in your cell, and though it punished every nerve, you took up your pen, you wrote it all down. The reason they tortured Anne Askew was because they wanted her to give up the names of other Protestant noblewomen. It was basically a sort of backdoor attempt to overthrow the monarchy, and it didn't work because she didn't tell them anything, in spite of being tortured for hours. So she was a hell of a lady. Another very principled person was Giles Corey, who I've also written about here. He was one of the 20 people executed as part of the Salem witchcraft trials. Salem was a very unusual witchcraft trial. It didn't follow the same patterns that a lot of the European ones did. And you might have come across the story of Salem from Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which is a wonderful piece of fiction. But if you want to hear about what really happened at Salem, I recommend a book called The Witches, Salem 1692, A History by Stacey Schiff. I read that book and it kind of had such an impression on me that I went to Salem in October 2019, and I went to try and find the grave of Giles Corey, or at least see where he was roughly placed. He was one of the few people in Salem who, while the witchcraft hysteria was going on, was willing to speak up and say, this is a charade, this is a spectacle, it's unacceptable that people are being put to death and imprisoned over this, and it has to stop. And for his integrity, he was treated to a particularly horrible execution. Everyone else was hanged. He was put into a pit and a board put on top of him, and then the pit filled with stones. And then his body was put somewhere in this particular city block. That's as specific as anyone can be about where he's buried. So I went to this city block in Salem just to kind of see him. So this is Giles Corey, died 1692. Howard Street is a plumb line, chain link, asphalt, October, gauze ghosts tacked to screen doors. A throne porch pumpkin smashed 4 ways against the fence. It's midweek, quiet under lime yellow leaves. It feels like agreed forgetfulness. These homes built in the gap of years, and no one left alive who knows where you were put beyond this block somewhere. Beside each painted house, a truck. Dogs bark, clouds turn, and on the park, the fairground workers rev the haunted house awake. The weight. Smell of the donut fat tanks warming, gasoline on every well of rain, and you could be anywhere here, your bones flung down like seed, this place where an uneasy peace was made. The weight, this street, the park, the metal racks of Waltzer, Dodgem, hot dog stall, the entire pin-up fairground town. You bear it all. And I'll finish this section with Eunice Cole, who is a slightly happier story. She didn't have the greatest life. She was repeatedly accused of witchcraft and repeatedly jailed, but she was not executed. She was able to die of natural causes, which for the witchcraft hysteria times is a win. And the people of her town feared her so much that when she died, they buried her outside the town boundary with a stake through her heart. So this is Eunice Cole, died 1680. I was tired of the cart track the cattle were driven down, tired of their spattered white bodies passing like clouds. The ones that trailed the pack were whipped with sticks because that's what happens to stragglers. I was tired of living to see so many grass-fed boys grow like their fathers. Every year it was February that almost killed me. All that winter's patch-up jobs undone by weather, dead things in the root store. I was tired of the cherry in the windy garden, its hard little buds. I was tired of the stone in my dark red flesh. I counted every cobble in the floor of their jail. I slept on straw like the whipped grey calf that never grew right. I dreamed about the gallows rope holding its blue teardrop of night. I was tired of little girls being told not to come down my road. They planted me beyond the walls. In summer, the lords and ladies push up their executioners' hoods. The mushrooms on my choked grave are dark as boils. Everything rots with time. Even my stake, my famous stake, even my famous heart.
Thank you very much, Claire. I hope most people stayed on for that because it wasn't too scary. Thank you. We're now going to hear from Annemarie Austin. This is her new collection. It's her 8th collection, following her Bloodaxe retrospective, Very, which Bloodaxe published in 2008. And then she published a later collection in 2014 called Track. There's a comment that Jane Griffiths made on her work, which I think is worth hearing. Annemarie Austin's world is one of doubles and reflections. She is deeply engaged with shifting perspectives and challenging perceptions. And Carol Rumans said in The Guardian, where she had a poem of the week, lack of ostentation is part of the appeal of Austin's work. It voices mysteries with elegant composure. The mundane is met on its own terms, then all at once titled A Strangeness Exposed. Sometimes the art is in the omission. And she calls her a poet whose technical control, musicality, and gift for subtle surprise deserves wider notice. And I agree with that. I mean, we've published Annemarie Austin for decades now, and we admire her work greatly, but she's never received much wider attention, apart from getting a Poetry Book Society recommendation for just her first collection, but very little since. So you're now going to hear Annemarie reading a short set of poems from the new book, and you'll see the poems on the screen.
This is Annemarie Austin reading from Shall We Go? Shall We Go has a trajectory. The last line of the last poem is being altogether gone this time, but the collection begins with this poem, Shall We Go on the Shiny? The boy dragged a big spade behind him across the sand pockmarked by rain, towards where a high tide had left it smooth and sodden and reflective. Over his shoulder he asked the woman, Shall we go on the Shiny? Not her, she said, but she'd watch how he grew stilt-walker legs there, like a seagull stretched into heron, and any small ordinary dog, which showed instead as a stately hound, such as poses in swagger portraits. So he strode out alone with his spade onto the Shiny, and so she lost him, digging his way into a dazzle that raised its wall before her soon enough, and his footprints were swallowed up just as fast as he made them. Nail file. Think of filing down the Atlantic Ocean, which widens every year at roughly the rate of a fingernail growing. There was a rock in that ocean. There was a bobbing raft. He stood on the rock and saw nothing in the water. Nothing should use that raft to reach his rock. So he hauled in the raft by its rope and tied it to the rock. After a while, he was sure he saw how this rock diminished as the Atlantic widened, and so stood on one leg to be smaller and more narrow. He certainly saw how raft and rope were frayed by the fret of rock against water. That was when he thought of filing down the ocean. Form. I had a dress form. A sort of wire netting corset I pressed against my waist and ribs and breasts, where the hip swelled and the shoulder knuckled. Then, carefully unbuckled, it served on its stand for my shed body, like a crab's, and did to fit all bodices against, to pin and tack them into submission. Though I slipped a kind of vest on it for best effect, I remember. Then my pins had purchase where otherwise was air worked. That was platonic me, between the collar and pubic bones. Sometimes it shone like a little silver teapot, or, vest pulled down on it, resembled antler velvet. For form was fiercer than shape would be, that could lie on a party plate impersonating rabbit in blancmange. This was birdcage on a pole. This was pot to catch the crab, to be cut up. The next poem was partly prompted by the treatment of the wife and now widow of an imprisoned Nobel Peace Prize winner in China, whose names I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. The title, Problem, comes from a Henri Bergson quotation. The insurmountable difficulties presented by certain philosophic problems arise from the fact that we separate out in space phenomena which do not occupy space. She's not the one, but they have to put her somewhere. Somewhere she can't bump up against the rest, whoever they might be. What clarifies is the space around each figure, the haloing of the hermit in his cave in the desert. Put her in the desert, perhaps, but keep her away from other hermits. Imagine the consequences of their breath entwining across the cave, the halos interlocking. There mustn't be merging. Smudge is forbidden, they say or don't say, but act on in her case. Examine her without a background. Ignore the negative space. Bore in on her concentrating. Look and look and look until she's seen right through and out the other side, on which there's nothing to do but return, come the opposite way, arrive in front of her who's become a structure of tunnels, a sort of perforated Alp of a person, though the grid of her's not fine enough yet, and she must be pierced and pierced at another point, another point. Undo this woman who just stands there, who just looks back at them, because her eyes have been rendered roots, her arm and leg bones pathways, and they come and go through her so fast they miss where they've been, have to reiterate that passage, unsupplied with resting places, nowhere to stop and know her. It's relentless to and fro and dig another tunnel. She stands there. Inside the woman, her memory of the undoing spider, the one that had second thoughts and let the bee go, although she had bound it already into a white buzzing tube. The woman had seen that. Then the woman had heard the bee's buzz grow louder, so she looked again, and the tube had put out a leg, then another. There was a wing, and the spider busy at its unwinding motion to one side. She remembered a moment of consideration on both parts. The spider of its work before returning to a corner, the bee of its constriction gone away, and sudden freedom it resolved to use in a scoop of flight, down and off. The house enters, house arrested her, its balcony her shoulders, her ribs the balustrade, should she lie on her side considering a garden. The grain of the floorboard is growing through her cheek, her ear its imitation. She can hear the knives in the door remaining closed. Her mouth is open as the window in the gable end, mortared with all her hair, stirred into the mixture.
Well, that was lovely hearing from Annemarie Austin. If you have any comments or questions you'd like to put to George or Claire, do put them into the chat and they'll be passed on to us at the end. So would you please welcome back George Szirtes?
Thank you very much. It's lovely to hear those quite fierce, small precisions of Annemarie's about fragility and negative spaces. But what I'd like to do here is to read from another section. This is the section about the siege under the plague. And these are a series of very short, notational, like 10-line poems. I'll be two sections. I'll read the two sections, and I'll just give the title of each small piece. So the first section comes from the middle of the whole series. This is called In Wartime. We were often told that, we were in a kind of engaged in a kind of war, and we were reminded of war. We were reminded of the Second World War and Dunkirk spirit and so on. In wartime, speech bubble. When a minister opens his mouth, a darkness emerges and fades into the background. Is it a failed speech bubble, or is it a thought? How many people are jostling in that darkness? And do they then fade into their own thoughts? Wartime. There are profiteers in the cupboard. There are thieves in the neat hedgerows. There are the rumours and the alarms. It's the times we live in, they say. Darling, these are days of anxiety. Listen to the high-pitched call of small birds. Kiss me. The enemy. Know your enemy, they said. The whites of their eyes. Start to learn their names. There was fog that day, and we could not see their eyes. Fields curled in grey mist. Nothing had eyes. The names we whispered were a grass rustling in a distant stream we hadn't yet crossed. Disasters of war. News of disaster is normal. Normality is the disaster. This is disaster, cries the headline. This being wind, flood, fire, and plague. Here is where we live, on the edge of the edge, light in the height of light, among the shadows. Ministry. At the ministry of nothing, there was little of interest. Ghosts flitted between rooms and along white corridors, shivering with cold. The past was gathered in a debating chamber, freezing as ever, and the dead told lies. This is the next section, in emergency. Emergency guide. Treat each question like an exquisite piece of dirt. Don't let it settle. Wave your hands around like a busyman trying to make himself clear. They know what you are and what they expect from you. You know what they are. They are God. They wait. Dry hands. Granted a briefing with graphs, charts, speeches, questions, approximations. A sparrow blurts past. The wasp fizzes against glass. You don't touch your face. The official sun brawls into sight. A woman wipes tears from her eyes with hands like paper. The future. The future will be exactly as predicted. There will be running and darkness and rain and a desperate longing for a vanished past as imagined by old heads. Hands will touch, lips meet, and someone will sing aloud to the wind. Fictions. Behind closing doors, the face draws back and the hand moves into shadow. The filming goes on. The cameras are rolling into deep fiction. What does the script say? Something is sure to happen. That's what doors are for. That's what fiction is. Science fiction. The minister sweats. There's nobody in the street, bar some friendly ghosts, administering angels, and sundry earthlings. It's science fiction in the suburbs. Now the aliens have landed. There will be speeches, fresh flowers, new myths. So those are two of the sections from that part of the book, which is called Going Viral. And I'll finish with this one poem, which comes from a sequence of bestiary poems, which start with rhymed quatrain and then a piece of prose. And this is Toad. Let me versify you into life in your oilskin coat with your outspread toes. I want to feel you leap right through my chest like phlegm in my mouth and nose. Between wall and fence, in a puddle of its own, the toad squatted. It must have been about important business, because it barely noticed me and did not look up at my approach. You will have to sit down and wait your turn. I can't do everything at once, it eventually remarked. So saying, it leapt into my open mouth and began to dictate affairs. It was only when I sneezed that it politely made its exit and settled back into a damp pocket of the universe.
Thank you, George. With that wonderful image of a toad being in your mouth, we'll now turn to Claire to read her second set.
Thank you very much. And thank you again, George. I'm so glad that somebody has written a sequence of poems about COVID and called it Going Viral, because someone really needed to make that pun. So I'm glad you have done that. The second theme of this book, the other kind of major theme of this book, apart from witches, is probably best summed up as men I have known for better or worse. And although I'm aware that my parents are watching this live stream, I am going to read some of them nevertheless, as mortifying as that may be. The first and last ones are performance pieces, so I will try not to shout at you. This first one is about how if you feel like you are catching feelings for a man, the absolute worst thing that you can do is write a poem about him. And it's called Playing It Cool. When you get to the point of writing poems about a man, that's it. Forget your protestations, your maybe just one drink, or we can take it slow. Better to admit the things you've already let him do in your imagination's curtained room. Remember Grant, a walking disaster of old regret, the way he ashed his silk cut with those nimble hands so you went home and wrote his clothes off in 10 bad lines? Yeah. Remember any one of them, these men with their good teeth, collarbones, forearms like brown rope, mooring yet another poem, subtexts flotsam lapping round its parched boards. Forget your I just want to be alone, The notebook's already full of his brown eyes, mussed hair, smart lines he fed you and you swallowed. Yes, that's a double entendre. Yes, he's pressed into a sharp suit. He's pulled you into his overcoat. And how could you not write out the shock of skin against cold silk? It felt almost wet. And there you go again, too late. You're hooked, you're sunk, your cover's blown. And worst, he knows it now, knows you couldn't fucking help yourself. You had to go and write it down. I apologize to my mother for the swear. It's mortifying to me that this book exists and is in my mother's hands. I've told her that I just don't want to discuss it. So the first poem in this collection is kind of fittingly maybe about my first ever serious boyfriend, whose name was Dominic, spelt D-O-M-O-N-I-C, which is quite unusual. I was 18 and he was 19. He was from Waco, Texas, and he was an ice cream van driver. And he cheated on me with a 16-year-old within months of us getting together. And for a long time, I wanted to write a poem about him. And it was always a dreadful poem, whatever I did, because I was still really angry with him. I realized. And now I'm 35 years old. I've just about got to the point where I've forgiven him, so I've been able to write this poem. Of all the people I've ever met, he is someone I would really, really like to just go for a beer with and say, what happened there and what's happened to you since? Because I haven't had any contact with him since I was 18 years old. And so this poem is kind of about that. It's called Dominic. This time of year, I think of you the most. Springtime, when I'm in love with everything. Behind the bar you liked on Candlemaker Row, the Kirkyard laburnums are budding. Come the summer, there'll be yellow Texas hairdos dropping pods of blossom on the old graves. I'm amazed that I still observe the days since you went wherever you went, that I still want to tell you things. Like, I look for you in crowds of out-of-towners, and in spring, sometimes there'll be a man who makes me pause, heart spilling its blooms. But there was only ever one of you, born with a misspelled name even Google corrects. Like, see, I'm searching. Like, I've learned there are collectors who want only broken things. Porcelain so loved that when it smashed, the cracks were sealed with gold. That's how I was broken by your going. Though it was a wrecking, it was also a making better. Like, thank you. Like, what I choose to do with you right now is go to the bar in the big white afternoon. No one else drinking, the window seat a gift box of jeweled light. Laburnum light, amber in the tall glasses lit up like bulbs. And after, I could walk away, every break and closure glowing. A lot of these poems are about the ending of relationships, and closure is important at the ending of relationships. In fact, the book was nearly called Breaking Closure after the final line of that poem. One of the strangest pieces of closure that I don't think many people talk about, but that feels very profound, is trying to find closure around never seeing someone's mother again. This is something that I've thought about a lot, that one of the hardest parts of breaking up with a man is knowing you're never going to see his mom again. And I decided to write a poem about that. It's sort of a poem about relationships, but really it's just sort of a love song to mothers. And it's called Mothers of Sons. The thing I think about most is who will care for my no longer mother-in-law when she's too thin-skinned for driving or cold rain or walks. She's a while, but it's coming soon enough that he and I discussed it nights in bed. His mother's hearing failing scared him. This is adulthood, he said, and I thought of my someday care for this woman I loved because she made his mind, his two good steady hands. She only had sons, one overseas, the other forgetting when Mother's Day was, standing her up, Me at the worktop rinsing his shirts and cursing this girl I'd become. His mother worked through my hazy long-term plan like an overlocked scene. But now I'm gone. Perhaps in time there'll be another girl he'll take to brunch, show off and hold in the dark of his mother's sparse spare room. I think of her stronger than me and slim, lifting his mother up out of a chair in an afternoon filled with low orange sun, then turning to the kitchen where the medicine rattles its powdery light. Might I be in another town by then, counting change from another old lady's purse, guiding her down from a bus, wrists so fragile in her new wool gloves? I'll see in her face the frown of a man I don't yet love, have yet to meet. And might I steer her home to the house where he was born, to brew strong tea as dusk floods under the doors? And somewhere my own mother, waiting for my brother's call, and somewhere my ex, forgetting his mum can't hear, stood on the porch, one hand on the bell, while a thin rain sugars in, come down country from me to him. And I'll finish with the title poem from this book, How to Burn a Woman. Neil and I had a bit of discussion about the title a while back and whether or not it might be upsetting to some people. It's my intention that it be kind of provocative for sure, but I really hope it's not upsetting. It's taken from this poem, which is intended to be a sort of rallying cry. It's for Anne Askew, but it's also for all of the women that I describe in this book and all of the women who were persecuted and executed for believing in the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, having sex with the wrong person, subverting the social norms of their time. And it's also a poem for anyone who still does that. So this is How to Burn a Woman. You will not need kindling. I think I'll go up quick as summer timber, my anger big and dry as a plantation that dreams of being paper, the updraft already made in the canopy and heading down. Bring your axe to split me into parts that you can stack over the dry leaves, over the coals, my old coat and my bedding box, the things given to me by women. You've heard of spontaneous human combustion. They say it's fat. Once lit, it flares so white hot fast the bones give in. So make your touch paper long. Spread the word that the crowd who will gather should stand well back. I am coated in the accelerant of men, my craving for their good necks, their bodies in button-downs, crisp as a new book. As you douse the embers, I will smell like ground elder choking the cemetery, roots looping up out of dead women's mouths, a problem thing you'll never get cleared. So make the stake thick, the bonds stiff on my innocent wrists. Burn me the same way you burned her. Do it because we took the plain thoughts from our own heads out into the square and spoke. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And maybe now this event is going to be on YouTube. Dominic may actually see it in the States and will come for you. We're next going to have a final short reading by Annemarie Austin with the poem shown on screen. If you want to buy copies of any of the poet's books, just scroll down on the YouTube page and you'll find links where you can buy them immediately online from Bloodaxe. So we're now going to hear Annemarie Austin reading some more poems, after which we're going to come together for a little discussion at the end. Thank you.
The facts in this next poem are true. It's called A True Vessel. He reached deep into the sequined bag, It was the size and shape of the calico one they'd made me write my name on in the dream, and said, "I like gifts which don't last." I didn't know my real name in that dream, but was told it was Vera Flagon. True vessel, I thought. I like that. I like to put in a lot of effort and have nothing to show for it at the end, the boy listed next. By then I had pen and paper out, and under the cafe table was writing down what he said. The sequins shifted and glinted. My dreamt cotton bag had been much plainer, even when labelled Vera Flagon in huge blue felt pen letters I translated as True Vessel. "I like people to steal things when they come to my house," he finally declared. I found that much later, where I'd put it away in the bag. Wishes for the poem as object. You could make a paper boat of this poem, if it weren't a paper boat already. You could shape an aeroplane to fly across the room. Look, though, it's flying now. I'll let you turn down the page and crease it as a dog ear to start the barking. You can mark the words and lines in ink or score a stanza with your thumbnail, but the poem's underpainting will show its skulls or planets through any overwriting and be hung up there on the wall in the good natural light from a great window. You can throw it down, but it will crawl away. You can carry it to another country and leave it at the station to catch the train it fancies all by itself. When the poem's trapped in a burning building, it will remember how to float and fly. Table/field. How round this anecdote is. How it's been rubbed down until it fits the hand, fits the lips again, can be held in the cheek like a sweet. Though the boiled sweet held too long wears the slick off the skin of the inside cheek. It's currency here. We're old, and our anecdotes roll about the table. I'm tired of this, but powerless to interrupt its ritual game of billiards. The metaphors get away, to lodge in the green baize pockets just as in a mouth. Imagine a plain field where you've been lying. You sit up to see its pleasing levelness and the gates in 4 hedges that offer a choice of routes. We could be old that way. We could choose an appealing gate and open it and go through. And here's that last poem I mentioned earlier. It's called The Place of Stations. It uses a quotation, and I've no idea where I got it from. Before the railways were built, what took the place of stations in our dreams? The Way to Go Away has all sorts of wriggles in it, of the 2 broad shoulders through the transom window on that back door, or shoulders again, shaking off a hand that would detain them, and the toss of the head demonstrating, "I don't care." God had begun to do it, in the fresco in Rome's San Clemente, his lower arm extruding from the rainbow-edged disk of heaven, the sleeve of a white robe tossed back from his hand. And it might have been such an escape when monks of Maiden Bradley laid hold on God a second, to be left as he wriggled away with a part of his coat they claimed to possess in their clutches. Those interfaces did to take the place of stations. Dreamt pieces of God went in and out of them, leaving brief traces. Meanwhile, when jumper fibres remain for clues on the frame of a transom window, I don't care, being altogether gone this time. And it's thanks to Helen for helping me with this recording.
And thanks to Annemarie for making that recording for us. We're now going to have a discussion and pick up on any comments or questions from the audience. First thing I'd like to put to George and Claire is what Claire talked about, the importance of not forgetting. And it seemed to me in both your books and in all your work is about not forgetting. Would one of you like to come in on that?
Well, the muses are the daughters of memory, it is said. Although memory is a wonderfully fickle thing and a wonderfully imaginative being. So one is sometimes chasing it around and hoping to locate oneself in a real place, which is furnished out with what that real place has been and how that place becomes a present for us. That is the way I suppose I tend to think about it. What about you, Claire?
I think I'm interested in the capturing of the details of individual stories, which I think is something that you do really beautifully in your Terza Remus section, the first section of the collection. Those memories of childhood, the details of them are so kind of vivid. Because for me, I've kind of noticed that suffering makes groups of people into a monolith a lot of the time. So I don't want to speak on your behalf, George, or on behalf of refugees, but I feel like refugees are one example of that there are so many people in that situation and their suffering is, we're very aware of it, but
oh yes,
we pay attention to the vast numbers rather than the individual stories. And that really struck me about people who were accused of witchcraft when I was researching them, that we think of the European witchcraft hysteria in terms of being a 200-year massive atrocity, but we kind of, when we do that, we lose sight of the stories of the individuals. And I think poetry is such a good vehicle for kind of dredging those stories up and giving them a small place to exist and just kind of, to celebrate the details of them.
Well, at one stage, my book was going to be possibly called Migrants, and it was full of migrations because, I mean, obviously my personal case, and I was just a child, but this story is constantly with us. So we're constantly seeing people turning up for various reasons, and the response to them being, well, there's a very wide range of response to them. And but of course, one does think about them. These are people who have upped and left and gone somewhere which you didn't know particularly well. It's very interesting. I mean, what I've enjoyed very much in your poems is if you like, the kind of full identification with the voices of the people. So in fact, you're sort of entering each person and you're kind of speaking from them. They almost feel like so dramatic monologues, but they're kind of slightly different from that, don't you think?
Yeah, it's interesting that some of them are some people are more accessible than others. I feel able to write in the first person about some of these people, but then others are less accessible to me. So Giles Corey, for example, it's interesting that he, I mean, firstly, that he's a man. I think I find it more difficult to write from the point of view of a man, but also he is this sort of lost person. We don't know where he's buried, and and I found it interesting that I couldn't really write not only from his point of view, I couldn't even write in his timeline, which was why I wrote the sort of contemporary setting of me going to Salem and sort of looking for him. So it
works. That really works for me. I love the end of the Giles Corey poem, precisely because you land us back to where we are. Yes, so they're not people with their own period. They're suddenly with us, and I think that's sort of really a very, very splendid ending for that poem.
Thank you very much,
George. Your book has several sections, and you're a very versatile poet, and you write in all kinds of different forms. But one thing that struck me tonight is you started off with the poems of your individual memory, your family memories, But when you moved to going viral, these were poems about people's experience, but somehow they became parables. So they became universal by being written almost as parables, where the detail wasn't so specific, but it was still representational.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I think in a way, poems like that can't help but be a little like parables, because we don't know the individuals who are experiencing these things, except we know that they are there. They're kind of everywhere. We hear their voices and then we lose their voices. It's about the state of things. And really, I suppose what I was trying to do in that sequence, I mean, I was writing every day. I was writing one of these short notes, poetic notes every day, and I selected from them. It's trying to understand where, not just where I was, but what sort of place is this? And where do we find ourselves? I think many people must have felt something very, very similar, who become disorientated, very easily disorientated, especially in that first lockdown that we suffered. And then we hear ourselves being talked back to or at, and then trying to sort of work out, well, what is actually happening here? I mean, it's not that because I was feeling particularly angry, though I was, but it wasn't that particularly that really fascinated me. It was that, where are these people and where are we? And I think that question is still valid.
Yes, in your case, the manuscript kept changing, didn't it? So that it, in a way, it's much more up to date than a lot of poets' manuscripts are, because you were changing whole sections, ditching whole sections, putting in new work as you were going along.
I'm kind of one of those possibly unfortunate beings who has to write a lot in order to write the best that he can. So I have a fair amount of spare over the years, several bookfuls. But you're trying to work out what the book is and see how does this stuff work together. I mean, there are aspects of work which I've done over the years with small presses, which are rarely part, if you like, of the persona that appears to inhabit the books. So those poems at the end, the toad that I was reading about at the end. And I think there's a wonderful kind of world out there of transformations, of kind of physical entrances and exits and so forth. So that is something which I expect I will carry on doing.
Claire, what's your journey been like from your first collection to your second collection? And how does D.I. Birch fit in terms of how you swing from one mode to another?
I wish I could say that there was a kind of grand unifying plan that takes in the poetry and the fiction, but I have thus far failed to get them to play nicely together. The crime fiction is very, very separate, and it uses a very different part of my brain than the poetry does. So people will ask me, are you going to write crime poems, or are you going to write a crime verse novel? And the answer is, I don't think that's ever going to happen, because I can't make them mesh. I can't write the two things on the same day, for example. They don't play nicely together. So I have to kind of compartmentalize a little bit. The journey from first collection to second collection has been quite interesting. I thought that How to Burn a Woman was going to be entirely about witches and people accused of witchcraft. And then I went away on a month-long retreat to Moniac Moor in the Highlands. It's a creative writing centre. I'm sure a lot of you have come across it. And I spent, and I had just left a relationship of 6 years, and indeed had to move out of my ex's house and was homeless. And when I came back from Moniac Moor, I didn't really know where I was going to live. But I'd got this residency as part of the Jessie Kesson Fellowship at Moniac Moor. And so I spent a kind of very frantic, strange month. It was March and it still snows up there in March. And I was kind of a lot of the time snowed in this cottage on my own, kind of pinging off the walls and thinking a lot about relationships and how they end and what they do to us. And I ended up writing tons and tons of poems about that, completely unexpectedly. And then I felt like I had to do something with them. So then it was a question of figuring out whether or not I could make these relationship poems and the witch poems coexist. And fortunately, I think I've managed to do it.
Yeah, I think you have. The men and women coexist in the same world, don't they? Even historically.
Well, yeah, exactly. And there's a kind of, because a lot of the people that I've been talking about who were accused of witchcraft were women, something like 85% we reckon were women. It fits in terms of sort of looking at the ways in which men and women interact generally.
We've got some comments now, not much in the way of questions. I'll just read a couple out and see how that feeds into things. Imtiaz Darker addressing George. You hold on to the street map of your heart. Lovely poem, George. In Duig, great to hear George again, even if only virtually, a lot better than nothing. And then Sudeep Sen, beautifully oblique evocation of English rain, so different from the furious rains in the monsoons of India where he is. Jess Glacier, excellent statement earrings, Claire. KJ McDonald says, what a fascinating ancestor, quite right to be proud of her. And Jess Glacier also, again, love that Anne lives on through her name being spoken. And Sudeep Sen also comes back with a comment on a wonderful reading by Annemarie. Karen Downs Barton, yes, the loved idea of being able to file the ocean. Sorry, that's a sort of a typo misprint on the chat. So she loved that idea of being able to file the ocean. Karen Downs Barton, today I used George's poem, Henrik Ross, Children of the Ghetto, with undergrads, and they love it. I'm looking forward to having more to share. Andrea Holland, great readings, and I love your love song to mothers, ex-mothers, Claire. I thought exactly the same. And Dominic Stevenson, not that Dom, but full of love for Claire's incredible writing. A question from Sudeep Sen. George, I've always loved your wide narrative and intellectual expanse and your use of form in your poems. What made you choose Tertzerima specifically in this case?
Well, I suppose when I started, this is my third Tertzerima sequence, the poems in real being the first. And I suppose two reasons, because just in terms of form, it's a very narrative form. So the middle line of one verse rhymes with the first and third of the next and so on, like a series of daisy chains or railway couplings. It's a naturally narrative form. And of course, it's chiefly associated with Dante. And it's a journey, the journey that he makes is an exploration of the existential world of his time. And in a way, I think that makes a good pattern. And once you begin to write in a particular way, I think it helps support more because you become used to the dimensions of it. There's a lovely phrase which Annemarie used. It's actually a title of a poem, isn't it? Wishes for the poem as object. And I can just quite see that these objects are tangible.
We don't have any other questions from the audience, but I was wondering whether either of you might have anything to say about each other's work or about Annemarie's work, or something you want to ask each other, having read each other's books and read Annemarie's book.
I mean, I wanted to say to George how much it struck me that your childhood poems are poems about a child who's new to these islands, who's kind of trying to make head nor tail of everything. But to me, they really struck a chord with me as well. It was just, as a child who was always trying to make sense of just being a person, there's also that in there. I really like the poem Diesel or Steam, where the child is presented with this question that they don't really understand what it means, but they know a huge amount rides on getting the answer right. And and then they get the answer right. And I really, really felt that I had been in that exact place many times.
Well, these are all real situations. Mm-hmm. So all of those 25 poems are based on quite specific memories. And in a way, something which has been running through my books for a long time is an attempt to understand where I live, England, yeah, and trying to get a handle on it. Yes, I thought with yours, actually, is that one of the things, I suppose in a way, the thing that most struck me is your physical sense, in the sense that you've got a very visual sense. So you see things, I think, very clearly. And your sense of dramatic form, dramatic shape, so you know where to come in. There are these two sorts of poems. You divided your reading into two halves. There were the rich poems, which are, of course, not unrelated to the poems about men, boyfriends, or whatever, relationships. So in a way, that was, I wouldn't put it like a conceptual field. It's a kind of emotional, psychic sort of field. But it is the physicality, the physical realization of everything that sort of made a particular impression on me.
That is really nice to hear. It's sort of, it's interesting as well that really feeds in nicely. I wanted to say something about a particular line of Annemarie's that actually I think does exactly what you've described, with the sort of just the precision of the physicality of this image. And it's from her poem The Unidentified, and she writes, "I had shaken and shaken the earth from my roots until they were white string for the brown paper parcel of myself." And that's just one of those lines where it kind of blows the top of your head wide open, like just absolutely amazing. I read that and had to kind of sit with it for a minute to
There's always, I think, an interesting understanding in Annemarie, or sort of groping towards an understanding of what it is to be vulnerable. I think there's a lot of vulnerability in the work, and fragile. And at the same time, developing a sense of irony in a way. If one listens to the everyday phrases she uses, apart from the images, because the images can be quite conceptual, but those everyday phrases set one at a certain distance to these complex things, like the whole idea of filing back the sea, which she herself chose to read. It's fascinating. I've actually known, well, I first met Annemarie 25, 30, 40 years ago. I think we may have published her as well. I'm not entirely sure. When we were doing our small portfolios. And it's so good to hear from her, because I think, as Neil says, and I think this is a danger for a lot of poets who we don't do anything apparently sensational. They're very quiet, they're very precise, but God, they're sharp. And in that sharpness, there's this kind of, it's like a much faceted brilliance. So really pleased to see her book as well as yours.
Thank you, George. And also, I think that the other thing about that sequence of yours, looking back, is that you're describing things that are real, but which were unfamiliar to you at the time. And there is that strangeness that comes from dealing with the ordinary, but it's also unfamiliar, and making the unfamiliar familiar in some way.
Well, life was weird. One had to get used to it. One had to get used to the language in which to try and respond to the weirdness. And those old things, like diesel or steam or table manners. People told me mischievously, the English tend to eat with their mouths open. And you sit down at a meal and you think, God, I'd better sit with my mouth open. These little delicacies whereby the way you tread your way into another society, which, and I don't know whether over time, it's become more familiar or stranger. And in a way, it's become both. And maybe that's why the poems turned out the way they did. Because I'm perfectly familiar with rain. There are poems about cricket. The first thing about cricket is what a strange thing to be doing. And one remembers the strangeness, but one is familiar. So you're trying to hold those things together and hoping that when you put together these various aspects of what it is, I will never know what it is to be English, but what it is to be, if you like, of the nation in some sense. Is that I keep hoping that little jigsaw pieces add up to something.
Right. Well, thank you. Claire, you've just come back again.
Yes, I just had technical difficulty there.
Something happened there. What about you? I mean, you grew up partly in Yorkshire, partly on the Scottish borders. You lived in Edinburgh for many, many years. Then the COVID pandemic situation pushed you back into England. You've gone between the two. How does it work for you with that switching between England and Scotland?
It's interesting, as George was talking just then, I was thinking it was obviously nowhere near as profound an experience for me, but because of course I am a sort of native English speaker, and there's not a huge difference across the borders in these islands, but moving from England to Scotland as a child of 8, I had a lot of similar experiences of being told that there were certain things that Scottish people do and say, you know, in a mischievous way to kind of make me make a social faux pas as an 8-year-old, or being kind of baffled by certain things that Scottish people would say. I remember being really confused by the expression, "Where do you stay?" by which Scottish folk mean, "Where do you live?" But I was always like, "Where do I stay? I don't. What do you mean?" So yeah, I've in a sort of much smaller way, I've had kind of similar experiences myself. But it's interesting. In terms of kind of my writing career, I've just recently left Edinburgh, as you say, kind of during COVID, and left behind the incredible Edinburgh Scottish writing scene, and I'm still kind of trying to figure out how to be a kind of border hopping poet and fiction writer. It feels very. I lived in Edinburgh for 16 years, and it's just such an incredible literary city. It's such a great place to be a writer, and I feel very out on my own now that I've come away from that scene. So if anybody watching is in the northwest of England and would like to introduce me to any literary events or people or entities, then I would greatly appreciate that. But it's a new adventure. It's a new adventure for the writing as well, which is exciting.
Okay. We'll finish with a couple more comments. From Colin. Claire, did you change the title from How to Burn a Witch to How to Burn a Woman? What made you decide on this change? Great title and great to hear all 3 poets. And Sudeep Sen, another question for Claire. How do you decide which poems will be performance poems and which will be more traditional for the page and for regular readings? I ask because I hear parallels in tonality in both.
I'll answer the second one first. So when I said that these are performance poems, I didn't necessarily write them for performance. It's more that, in my case anyway, I write poems and then certain ones kind of bring themselves forward as being more appropriate for performance. So that poem, How to Burn a Woman, for example, I performed it at a few readings and found that it really resonated with people, and people were coming up to me after the readings and saying they particularly liked that poem. And so it was one that I brought out more often at readings, and have also performed at slams a couple of times. And so a poem will just kind of become a performance poem over time for me. I don't set out to write a poem for the stage. They just kind of, some of them lend themselves better than others. And in terms of the title, it was never called How to Burn a Witch, because that seemed a bit on the nose. And also it's kind of important to me to make the distinction between referring to the people in this book as not as witches, but as people who were accused of witchcraft, because I mean, none of them were witches. They were people who had done nothing wrong fundamentally, who were a lot of the time kind of backed into a terrifying corner and had their own words and actions kind of used against them. The European witchcraft hysteria was essentially a kind of program of panicked eugenics designed to get rid of troublesome people who didn't fit social norms, or who were getting too above their station, or who owned property that could be better distributed in the eyes of the people who persecuted them, etc. It wasn't a case of people doing witchcraft and being punished for it. So I kind of, for all that I sometimes use the shorthand witches, I try to make clear that this isn't a book of poems about witches. It's a book of poems about persecuted people. The title was for a while Break and Closure, from that end line of the Dominic poem. But I kind of partly wanted to call it How to Burn a Woman just because that poem is so popular and it seemed to resonate with a lot of people. And so I wanted it to kind of have name recognition. I was hoping that people would remember that poem from hearing it and then go, oh, that's the book that's in. And also I think when people come up to you and say, I really like this, it's a good idea to kind of take note. So. Yep.
And of course, the poems about men are also about how to set a woman on fire. So,
yes,
in that sense. So, thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, George. And I'd like to thank Annemarie Austin for giving us the audio recording for use in tonight's event. Thank everyone for watching. Thank Pete Hebden from NCLA for being our wonderful techie. And just scroll down on the YouTube if you want to order any of the books, and you'll see the links there for ordering. So thank you very much for coming to the event.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Neil, for hosting as well.
That's good. Very good.
Yep.
Works very well, didn't it? I mean, not seeing in the audience.
Yeah, I've no idea how many people there were.